Hello, Carlson Champions. It is Miss Carlson here for your first book reading of Because of Winn Dixie. So I hope all of you got your Winn Dixie books in the mail. They had bookmarks in them. I wrote you a little note. I hope you enjoyed them, and I hope you love reading along with me every day. So if you got to join our Zoom pajama party, which was so much fun on Monday night, we read chapters 1 and 2 already. But if you did not, that's okay. I'm going to go ahead and read the first 2 chapters to you right now so you can watch. I would love if you would have your book out and read along with me so we can practice your fluency while we do this, but make it an enjoyable experience. Sometimes I'll read outside, sometimes I'll read in a comfy spot. I'll have to show y'all my favorite reading spot in my house a little later next time. Maybe I'll put on some of my comfy pajamas. But for today, since it's beautiful outside, I'm going to read you chapters 1 and 2. And then on a separate video, I'll do chapter 3 so that you can be keeping along with me even if you went to the pajama party. So Because of Winn Dixie is one of my favorite books. And I'm hoping we can have a party toward the end, a Zoom party where maybe we can watch the movie together. I'm going to see what I can do, but we can figure something fun out. All right, so chapter 1. Your pages should look the same as mine. I believe if I'm flipping a page that even though my book is a little different than yours, you will be flipping a page as well, okay? So chapter 1. My name is India Opal Baloney, and last summer my daddy, the preacher, sent me to the store for a box of macaroni and cheese, some white rice, and 2 tomatoes, and I came back with a dog. This is what happened. I walked into the produce section of the Winn Dixie grocery store to pick out my 2 tomatoes, and I almost bumped right into the store manager. He was standing there all red-faced and screaming and waving his arms around. "Who let a dog in here?" He kept on shouting. "Who let a dirty dog in here?" At first, I didn't see a dog. There were just a lot of vegetables rolling around on the floor, tomatoes and onions and green peppers, and there was what seemed like a whole army of Winn Dixie employees running around, waving their arms, just the same way the store manager was waving his. And then the dog came running around the corner. He was a big dog and ugly, and he looked like he was having a real good time. His tongue was hanging out and he was wagging his tail. He skidded to a stop and smiled right at me. I had never before in my life seen a dog smile, but that's what he did. He pulled back his lips and showed me all his teeth. Then he wagged his tail so hard that he knocked off some oranges off a display, and they went rolling everywhere, mixing in with the tomatoes and onions and green peppers. If you're with me, we're on the top of page 11. The manager screamed, "Somebody grab that dog!" The dog went running over to the manager, wagging his tail and smiling. He stood up on his hind legs. You could tell that all he wanted to do was get face to face with the manager and thank him for the good time he was having in the produce department. But somehow he ended up knocking the manager over. And the manager must have been having a bad day because lying there on the floor, right in front of everybody, he started to cry. The dog leaned over him, real concerned, and licked his face. "Please," said the manager, "somebody call the pound." "Wait a minute," I hollered. "That's my dog. Don't call the pound." All the Winn Dixie employees turned around and looked at me. And I knew I had done something big and maybe stupid too. But I couldn't help it. I couldn't let the dog go to the pound. "Here, boy," I said. The dog stopped licking the manager's face and put his ears up in the air and looked at me, like he was trying to remember where he knew me from. "Here, boy," I said again, and then I figured that the dog was probably just like everybody else in the world, that he would want to get called by a name. Only I didn't know what his name was, so I just said the first thing that came to my head. I said, "Here, Winn Dixie." And that dog came trotting over to me just like he'd been doing it his whole life. The manager sat up and gave me a hard stare, like maybe I was making fun of him. "It's his name," I said. "Honest." The manager said, "Don't you know not to bring a dog into the grocery store?" "Yes, sir," I told him. "He got in by mistake. I'm sorry, it won't happen again." "Come on, Winn Dixie," I said to the dog. I started walking and he followed along behind me. As I went off out of the produce department and down the cereal aisle and past all the cashiers and out the door. Once we were safe outside, I checked him over real careful, and he didn't look that good. He was big, but skinny. You could see his ribs. And there were bald patches all over him, places where he didn't have any fur at all. Mostly, he looked like a big piece of brown carpet that had been left out in the rain. "You're a mess," I told him. "I bet you don't belong to anyone." He smiled at me. He did that thing again where he pulled back his lips and showed me his teeth. He smiled so big that it made him sneeze. It was like he was saying, "I know I'm a mess. Isn't it funny?" It's hard not to immediately fall in love with a dog who has a good sense of humor. "Come on," I told him. "Let's see what the preacher has to say about you." And the two of us, me and Winn Dixie, started walking home. Okay, so the next chapter. So we've met two main characters so far. So be thinking to yourself while I read, who are these two main characters and how are they going to progress throughout the story? Because this book has a lot of characters. So we're going to see a big storyline. But we know so far we have Opal and we have Winn Dixie. She talks a little bit about somebody else who will come into this chapter. Chapter 2, page 15. That summer, I found Winn Dixie was also the summer me and the preacher moved to Naomi, Florida, so he could be the new preacher at Open Arms Baptist Church of Naomi. My daddy is a good preacher and a nice man, but sometimes it's hard for me to think about him as my daddy because he spends so much time preaching or thinking about preaching or getting ready to preach. And so in my mind, I think of him as the preacher. Before I was born, he was a missionary in India. And that's how I got my first name. But he calls me by my second name, Opal, because that was his mother's name, and he loved her a lot. Anyway, while me and Winn Dixie walked home, I told him how I got my name, and I told him how I just moved to Naomi. I also told him about the preacher and how he was a good man, even if he was too distracted with sermons and prayers and suffering people to go to grocery shopping. But you know what, I told Winn Dixie? You are a suffering dog. So maybe he'll take you right away. Maybe he'll let me keep you. Winn Dixie looked up at me and wagged his tail. He was kind of limping, like something was wrong with one of his legs. And I have to admit, he stunk bad. And he was an ugly dog. But already, I loved him with all my heart. Top of 17. When we got to the Friendly Corners trailer park, I told Winn Dixie that he had to behave right and be quiet because this was an all-adult trailer park. And the only reason I got to live in it was because the preacher was a preacher, and I was a good, quiet kid. I was what the Friendly Corners trailer park manager, Mr. Alfred, called an exception. And I told Winn Dixie he had to act like an exception too. Specifically, I told him not to pick any fights with Mr. Alfred's cats or Miss Detwiller's little yappy Yorkie dog, Samuel. Winn Dixie looked up at me while I was telling him everything, and I swear he understood. "Sit," I told him when we got out to my trailer. He sat right down. He had good manners. "Stay here," I told him. "I'll be right back." The preacher was sitting in the living room, working at the little fold-out table. He had papers spread all around him like he was rubbing his nose. Oh, and he was rubbing his nose, which always means he's thinking hard. "Daddy," I said. "Mm-hmm," he said back. "Daddy, do you know how you always tell me that we should help those less fortunate than ourselves?" "Mm-hmm," he said. He rubbed his nose and looked around at his papers. "Well," I said, "I found a less fortunate at the grocery store." "Is that right?" he said. "Yes, sir," I told him. I stared at the preacher real hard. Sometimes he reminded me of a turtle hiding in his shell, in there thinking about all the things and not ever sticking his head out into the world. "Daddy, I was wondering, could this less fortunate, could he stay with us a while?" Finally, the preacher looked up at me. "Opal," he said, "what are you talking about?" "I found a dog," I told him, "and I want to keep him." "No dogs," the preacher said. "We've talked about this before. You don't need a dog." "I know it," I said, "but I know I don't need a dog, but this dog needs me. Look," I said. I went to the trailer and I hollered, "Winn Dixie!" Winn Dixie's ears shot up in the air and he grinned and sneezed. Then he came limping up the steps and into the trailer and put his head right in the preacher's lap, right on top of a pile of papers. The preacher looked at Winn Dixie. He looked at his ribs and his matted up fur and the places where he was bald. The preacher's nose wrinkled up, like I said. The dog smelled pretty bad. When Dixie looked up at the preacher, he pulled back his lips and showed the preacher all his crooked yellow teeth and wagged his tail and knocked some of the preacher's papers off the table. Then he sneezed and some more papers fluttered to the floor. "What did you call this dog?" the preacher asked. "Winn Dixie," I whispered. I was afraid to say anything too loud. I could see that Winn Dixie was having a good effect on the preacher. He was making him poke his head out of his shell. "Well," said the preacher, "he's a stray if I've ever seen one." He put down his pencil and scratched Winn Dixie behind the ears. "And a less fortunate, too, that's for sure." "Are you looking for a home?" the preacher asked real soft to Winn Dixie. Winn Dixie wagged his tail. "Well," the preacher said, "I guess you found one." So that is the end of chapter 2. So on a separate video, each day I'll try to put a different chapter. So I just did chapter 1 and 2 together for the people who missed the pajama party. So like I said, we'll meet a lot of characters in this book. So I want you to think about the 4 characters we've met so far. 3 of them are main characters. And then Mr. Alfred, he definitely is a big character too. He's just not one of the main ones. So we have India Opal, who we call Opal. We have the preacher, and we have Winn Dixie. I want you to think about why she calls the preacher the preacher. We read it. See if you can find that answer in here, because that plays a big part in later in the book. Okay, so they're going to go on lots of adventures together. So stay tuned for some more fun Winn Dixie adventures, and stay tuned for video for chapter 3 coming tomorrow. Thank you, friends.